text for the sermon this morning is the conclusion of the 15th chapter of Acts. We will read from verse 36. This follows the council in Jerusalem, where the church had worked through a very, very difficult and divisive issue and had come to an agreement, and they had sent their emissaries to Antioch along with Paul and Barnabas to let everybody know what had been decided. And we pick up that in Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
In 1991, following a high-speed chase, a drunk man and two of his companions, police finally caught up with him, was dragged from the car and rather unceremoniously given to go, was beaten, really. His name was Rodney King, and that beating was captured on video taken by one George Holliday from the balcony of his apartment. He called the police 2 days later to tell them that he had the video of all that, and they weren't interested, and so then he called a television station, KTLA, who edited out some of the worst footage, the beginning of it. He didn't get all of the thing, he just mostly got the beating part. But the TV station edited out the part that he did have because it was too blurry, the part that showed Rodney King charging the police in a very threatening manner. But to see the beating was to be rightly outraged, and the public was. It led, in fact, to charges of assault with a deadly weapon and excessive use of force against 4 officers who were acquitted of those charges, all of them, in April of 1992. That verdict triggered riots in South Central LA. Riots that lasted for days, killed 53 people, over 2,000 injured, 9,500 arrested for rioting, looting, and arson. There were over 7,000 fires set. 3,200 or so businesses received damage from light to extensive. And in total, the damage to property was about $1 billion. The riots lasted until finally the Marines and the Army and the National Guard were called in to shut them down. It was on the 3rd day of those riots that Rodney King made a public appearance and on television uttered those words that we remember: "Can we all just get along?" Now, King had eluded the police in the high-speed chase because he feared what was coming due to his intoxicated condition while driving was a violation of probation charge, and back to jail he would go for the robbery conviction that he was still on probation from. Since that time, Rodney King has been arrested multiple times and had convictions further on DUIs and domestic violence as well. He did win a $3.8 million settlement from the city. And in fact, the officers were later convicted in federal court, some of them, and spent some jail time with that. King shared his struggles with substance abuse. He was an addict. That's what his problem was. As a reality TV star on VH1's Celebrity Rehab, a show I've never had the opportunity to watch and might not take advantage of it if I ever did. He also wrote a book, 2012 memoir. It's called The Riot Within: My Journey from Rebellion to Redemption. on the 20th anniversary of the riots, also in 2012. King told CNN that he'd forgiven the officers who had beaten him. He says, "Yes, I've forgiven them because I've been forgiven so many times. My country's been good to me, and I've done some things that wasn't pleasant in my lifetime, and I've been forgiven for that." Ironically or tragically, Rodney King's life ended later that same year in June of 2012 when his fiancée found him at the bottom of his swimming pool when she came home. It was ruled accidental drowning with contributing factors that included the presence of alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, and PCP in his system. The BBC quoted King himself in analyzing his legacy, and they said this. King said this about himself: "Some people feel like I'm some kind of hero. Others hate me. They say I deserved it. Other people, I can hear them mocking me for when I called for an end to the destruction, like I'm a fool for believing in peace." So the mixed bag that was the life of Rodney King has ended. Almost 4 years ago now, 3.5. And the truth remains, sometimes we can all get along, and sometimes, well, not so much. Sometimes we act like we can get along, and that's the most important thing in our lives, and sometimes we act like that's the last thing we have any interest in. And it turns out that none of us are exempt. Even great men are just men. Even great men on a mission for God, as in the case of Paul and Barnabas, are just men. Last week, after this wonderful watching the church work through a difficult issue and how they came out and did so well, and then we just get ready to start, and here go Paul and Barnabas at each other. But it wasn't just a spat. They disagreed on how to deal with Mark, who was Barnabas' cousin and a deserter of the mission field. And so, not being just a spat, it caused the breakup of Paul and Barnabas. Now think about that. It was Barnabas that introduced Paul to the elders at Jerusalem. And it was his testimony that allowed them to accept Paul for who God had called him to be. It was Barnabas, as a leader in the Antioch church, that went to Tarsus and brought Paul back to Antioch, where he too became one of the leaders. It was Barnabas that went on the first missionary journey with Paul. Together they suffered. And together they watched people come to Christ. This was not a breakup that was just imminent. This would have been a hard thing for either of them. And you wonder if our episode from Acts is just a preview of what life is like, even a life like that of Rodney King? Perhaps. But I think there are some lessons worth noting from Paul and Barnabas and Mark. And the first one is the nature of the dispute. The dispute was about how best do we go about doing mission work. It wasn't about personal preferences. It wasn't about personal animosity. It wasn't about personalities clashing. It wasn't about any of that. It was about how best do we accomplish the work that God has given to us. Our mission to the Gentiles. Both Paul and Barnabas agreed that they should undertake a second missionary journey. Both continued their mission work doing that very thing from the church in Antioch. Barnabas and Mark off to Cyprus, which was the first stop on the first missionary journey. Paul retraced his steps. We'll learn when we hit the next piece of the text. Overland. Apparently, neither Paul nor Barnabas hurled insults at each other, even though it was personal, involved family. Nor was there any apparent division in the church. Paul and Barnabas weren't working hard to get people on their side. And it's simply because they all agreed on the big picture, which is that it's very important to bring this gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. I find that to be refreshing and often different from the disputes that I have managed to be a part of or to referee in the church. Church that merged with us had a treasurer that had been treasurer for about 1.5 million years. And he was very good. He was very hard to deal with. But the merged church agreed, the merged session agreed to name him as treasurer, and so John came on board. And it was most difficult, especially when we were trying to sort out finances of both churches and put them together in one church. And I talked to the paid person we had on the staff. She was our financial secretary. And she had not one kind thing to say about the treasurer, saying that he was motivated simply by his own desire to have power over others, that the reason it was difficult to get information from him was because he didn't want you to know it. He wanted you to have to ask him for it, where he could give you what he thought was best rather than what you were asking for. I was disturbed by that comment, and as the pastor that came on board as my co-pastor finally admitted to me that he should have done something about John a long time ago, those were his parting words when he went to take his sabbatical. This whole merger thing just wore the poor guy out. Their associate pastor took a sabbatical. He took a sabbatical. Did I take a sabbatical? No. What was wrong with me? I look back on this time, and that's the biggest mistake I ever made in ministry. But I told him when I left, I said, I'm going to approach this thing head on. We're going to do something about this. Can't go on like this. And he agreed. And so I worked on my relationship with John and got John to say regularly to me that how, yes, because I said to him, John, you've been treasurer for 17 years. It just seems like 1.5 million, but it's 17 years. And I said, you must really be ready for a break by now. I can't imagine you haven't done this. It's all this work for so long a time. So, oh yes, I'd love to take a break. So, the problem is finding somebody to take my place. Yeah, that's a problem that I immediately went to work on. It took me about 3 days to find somebody to take his place. And at the next session meeting, as we were going in, I told John, I said, John, I got great news for you, brother. We're going to finally get you a break. We found somebody that can take your place. And I'm going to bring it up to the session. And of course, I told him that on the way into the session meeting because I did not want him to have time to work against it. And so it went through. The session passed. We had a new treasurer, actually the treasurer from our church. Wonderful guy. It was great. Except John wouldn't take no for an answer. So we gathered a couple of elders on his side. And they plotted, and finally they ambushed the treasurer newly installed, who was busy with a couple of other elders counting the receipts from the morning services, dragged him out of there and told him about how it would be a difficult thing for the church now in this time of transition to have a new treasurer. And wouldn't it be best if he just resigned and returned the job to John, which of course Larry, being the person who would avoid in conflict and would want no part of that, immediately agreed to. See, it wasn't about what was best for the church. It wasn't about what was best for me. It was about what I want. And I find that dynamic fuels a lot of church disputes and keeps them active for days. No years. No decades. That's the first thing, the nature of the dispute. Second thing, recognize that the rift was not permanent. Paul certainly reconciled with Mark. He speaks fondly of him in several passages, but near the end of his life, in 2 Timothy 4:11, he writes this to Timothy, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in my ministry. Now, do you think Barnabas, being Mark's cousin, that Paul didn't reconcile with Barnabas as well? Of course he did. We don't have a biblical record of that, but it's the only correct assumption. I don't see this so much either in present-day church disputes. Everything is eternally significant in the church, right? Larry met with us in prayer group for a season. Larry was a very competent, professional man in charge. He had been a part of a new church startup in Catoosa County that had gone very well. They were doing great. And he was always telling us about the new kinds of things they were doing and how they were training people into discipleship, and he was very involved in that. The Baptist church, they had elected elders I don't know, they just didn't know what they were doing. But he was an elder in their church, and so there was much that depended on him. He just oversaw so much, and it was great. And Larry kind of gradually got away from coming, and it was fine. But I heard that Larry wasn't going to the church anymore, and so when I saw him one time, I asked him about it, and he told me about how when the organizing pastor had left, and he was part and parcel of calling the new guy. He was in the middle of all that. I remember him talking about how excited he was. Somehow or another, they had gotten... And he'd left the church, and he vowed to me then, he said, it's a shame what that guy is doing to that church, and I'll never, ever go back there. And I believed him. That's what it is for us, isn't it? A disagreement's eternal. Reconciliation optional. Except it's hard to find that in the Scriptures. The third thing that you need to know is that what this passage displays for us is the art of moving forward in God's will, even when we're not in agreement. Can I tell you that God's opinion matters more than yours or mine? It's possible to do that, The mission of the church did not suffer. The reclaiming of Mark, remember Mark? The one who was the mission deserter? Evidently that did not get passed over either. He becomes a second generation leader. Most people understand, and really almost a personal assistant to Peter. Most scholars agree that the Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel according to Peter as written down by Mark. In short, the dispute that we see in this last bit of the 15th chapter of Acts receded apparently fairly quickly into its proper position, which is that of little importance. How many of us have gotten so worked up and so angry and have made decisions over things that as we now look back of them, we say, wow, I can't believe that was so important at that point, that I had to do that.